Chapter 27. For 3 years now, Lester had been happy in the companionship of Jennie. Irregular as the connection might be in the eyes of the church and of society, it had brought him peace and comfort, and he was perfectly satisfied with the outcome of the experiment. His interest in the social affairs of Cincinnati was now practically nil, and he had consistently refused to consider any matrimonial proposition which had himself as the object. He looked on his father's business organization as offering a real chance for himself if he could get control of it, but he saw no way of doing so. Robert's interests were always in the way, and if anything, the two brothers were farther apart than ever in their ideas and aims. Lester had thought once or twice of entering some other line of business, or of allying himself with another carriage company, but he did not feel that he could conscientiously do this. Lester had his salary, $15,000 a year as secretary and treasurer of the company. This brother was vice president, and about $5,000 from some outside investments. He had not been so lucky or so shrewd in speculation as Robert had been. Aside from the principal, which yielded his $5,000, he had nothing. Robert, on the other hand, was unquestionably worth between $300,000 and $400,000, in addition to his future interest in the business, which both brothers shrewdly suspected would be divided somewhat in their favor. Robert and Lester would get a fourth each, they thought. Their sisters, a sixth. It seemed natural that Keynes Sr. should take this view, seeing that the brothers were actually in control and doing the work. Still, there was no certainty. The old gentleman might do anything, or nothing. The probabilities were that he would be very fair and liberal. At the same time, Robert was obviously beating Lester in the game of life. What did Lester intend to do about it? There comes a time in every thinking man's life when he pauses and takes stock of his condition, when he asks himself how it fares with his individuality as a whole, mental, moral, physical, material. This time comes after the first heedless flights of youth have passed, when the initiative and more powerful efforts have been made, and he begins to feel the uncertainty of results and final values which attaches itself to everything. There is a deadening thought of uselessness which creeps into many men's minds, the thought which has been best expressed by the preacher in Ecclesiastes. Yet Lester strove to be philosophical. What difference does it make, he used to say to himself, whether I live at the White House or here at home, or at the Grand Pacific? But in the very question was the implication that there were achievements in life which he had failed to realize in his own career. The White House represented the rise and success of a great public character. His home and the Grand Pacific were what had come to him without effort. He decided for the time being, it was about the period of the death of Jennie's mother, that he would make some effort to rehabilitate himself. He would cut out idling. These numerous trips with Jennie had cost him considerable time. He would make some outside investments. If his brother could find avenues of financial profit, so could he. He would endeavor to assert his authority. He would try to make himself of more importance in the business rather than let Robert gradually absorb everything. Should he forsake Jennie? That thought also came to him. She had no claim on him. She could make no protest. Somehow he did not see how it could be done. It seemed cruel, useless. Above all, though he disliked to admit it, it would be uncomfortable for himself. He liked her, loved her, perhaps, in a selfish way. He didn't see how he could desert her very well. Just at this time, he had a really serious difference with Robert. His brother wanted to sever relations with an old and well-established paint company in New York, which had manufactured paints especially for the house, and invest in a new concern in Chicago, which was growing and had a promising future. Lester, knowing the members of the Eastern firm, their reliability, their long and friendly relations with the house, was in opposition. His father at first seemed to agree with Lester, but Robert argued out the question in his cold, logical way, his blue eyes fixed uncompromisingly upon his brother's face. "We can't go on forever," he said, "standing by old friends just because father here has dealt with them, or you like them. We must have a change. The business must be stiffened up. We're going to have more and stronger competition." "It's just as father feels about it," said Lester at last. "I have no deep feeling in the matter. It won't hurt me one way or the other. You say the house is going to profit eventually. I've stated that the argument's on the other side." "I'm inclined to think that Robert is right," said Archibald Cain calmly. "Most of the things he has suggested so far have worked out." Lester colored. "Well, we won't have any more discussion about it then," he said. He rose and strolled out of the office. The shock of this defeat, coming at a time when he was considering pulling himself together, depressed Lester considerably. It wasn't much, but it was a straw, and his father's remark about his brother's business acumen was even more irritating. He was beginning to wonder whether his father would discriminate in any way in the distribution of the property. Had he heard anything about his entanglement with Jennie? Had he resented the long vacations he had taken from business? It did not appear to Lester that he could be justly chargeable with either incapacity or indifference, so far as the company was concerned. He had done his work well. He was still the investigator of propositions put up to the house, the student of contracts, the trusted adviser of his father and mother. But he was being worsted. Where would it end? He thought about this, but could reach no conclusion. Later in this same year, Robert came forward with a plan for reorganization in the executive department of the business. He proposed that they should build an immense exhibition and storage warehouse on Michigan Avenue in Chicago and transfer a portion of their completed stock there. Chicago was more central than Cincinnati. Buyers from the West and country merchants could be more easily reached and dealt with there. It would be a big advertisement for the house, a magnificent evidence of its standing and prosperity. Cain Sr. and Lester immediately approved of this. Both saw its advantages. Robert suggested that Lester should undertake the construction of the new buildings. It would probably be advisable for him to reside in Chicago a part of the time. The idea appealed to Lester, even though it took him away from Cincinnati, largely if not entirely. It was dignified and not unrepresentative of his standing in the company. He could live in Chicago and he could have Jennie with him. The scheme he had for taking an apartment could now be arranged without difficulty. He voted yes. Robert smiled. "I'm sure we'll get good results from this all around," he said. As construction work was soon to begin, Lester decided to move to Chicago immediately. He sent word for Jennie to meet him, and together they selected an apartment on the north side, a very comfortable suite of rooms on a side street near the lake, and he had it fitted up to suit his taste. He figured that living in Chicago he could pose as a bachelor. He would never need to invite his friends to his rooms. There were his offices where he could always be found, his clubs, and the hotels. To his way of thinking, the arrangement was practically ideal. Of course, Jennie's departure from Cleveland brought the affairs of the Gerhardt family to a climax. Probably the home would be broken up, but Gerhardt himself took the matter philosophically. He was an old man, and it did not matter much where he lived. Bass, Martha, and George were already taking care of themselves. Veronica and William were still in school, but some provision could be made for boarding them with a neighbor. The one real concern of Jennie and Gerhardt was Vesta. It was Gerhardt's natural thought that Jennie must take the child with her. What else should a mother do? "Have you told him yet?" he asked her. when the day of her contemplated departure had been set. "No, but I'm going to soon," she assured him. "Always soon," he said. He shook his head. His throat swelled. "It's too bad," he went on. "It's a great sin. God will punish you, I'm afraid. The child needs someone. I'm getting old, otherwise I would keep her. There is no one here all day now to look after her right as she should be." Again he shook his head. "I know," said Jennie weakly. "I'm going to fix it now. I'm going to have her live with me soon. I won't neglect her, you know that." "But the child's name," he insisted. "She should have a name. Soon, in another year, she goes to school. People will want to know who she is. It can't go on forever like this." Jennie understood well enough that it couldn't. She was crazy about her baby. The heaviest cross she had to bear was the constant separations and the silence she was obliged to maintain about Vesta's very existence. It did seem unfair to the child, and yet Jennie did not see clearly how she could have acted otherwise. Vesta had good clothes, everything she needed. She was at least comfortable. Jennie hoped to give her a good education. If only she had told the truth to Lester in the first place. Now it was almost too late, and yet she felt that she had acted for the best. Finally, she decided to find some good woman or family in Chicago who would take charge of Vesta for a consideration. In a Swedish colony to the west of LaSalle Avenue, she came across an old lady who seemed to embody all the virtues she required: cleanliness, simplicity, honesty. She was a widow, doing work by the day, but she was glad to make an arrangement by which she should give her whole time to Vesta. The latter was to go to kindergarten when a suitable one should be found. She was to have toys and kindly attention, and Mrs. Olson was to inform Jennie of any change in the child's health. Jennie proposed to call every day, and she thought that sometimes when Lester was out of town, Vesta might be brought to the apartment. She had had her with her at Cleveland, and he had never found out anything. The arrangements completed, Jennie returned at the first opportunity to Cleveland to take Vesta away. Gerhardt, who had been brooding over his approaching loss, appeared most solicitous about her future. "She should grow up to be a fine girl," he said. "You should give her a good education. She's so smart." He spoke of the advisability of sending her to a Lutheran school and church, but Jennie was not so sure of that. Time and association with Lester had led her to think that perhaps the public school was better than any private institution. She had no particular objection to the church, but she no longer depended upon its teachings as a guide in the affairs of life. Why should she? The next day it was necessary for Jennie to return to Chicago. Vesta, excited and eager, was made ready for the journey. Gerhardt had been wandering about, restless as a lost spirit, while the process of dressing was going on. Now that the hour had actually struck, he was doing his best to control his feelings. He could see that the 5-year-old child had no conception of what it meant to him. She was happy and self-interested, chattering about the ride in the train. "Be a good little girl," he said, lifting her up and kissing her. "See that you study your catechism and say your prayers. And you won't forget that Grandpa..." "What?" He tried to go on, but his voice failed him. Jennie, whose heart ached for her father, choked back her emotion. "There," she said. "If I'd thought you were going to act like that..." She stopped. "Go," said Gerhardt manfully. "Go. It is best this way." And he stood sullenly by as they went out of the door. Then he turned back to his favorite haunt, the kitchen, and stood there staring at the floor. One by one they were leaving him. Mrs. Gerhardt, Bass, Martha, Jennie, Vesta. He clasped his hands together after his old-time fashion and shook his head again and again. "So it is. So it is, he repeated. They all leave me. All my life goes to pieces. Chapter 28. During the 3 years in which Jennie and Lester had been associated, there had grown between them a strong feeling of mutual sympathy and understanding. Lester truly loved her in his own way. It was a strong, self-satisfying, determined kind of way, based solidly on a big natural foundation, but rising to a plane of genuine spiritual affinity. The yielding sweetness of her character both attracted him and held him. She was true and good and womanly to the very center of her being. He had learned to trust her, to depend upon her, and the feeling had but deepened with the passing of the years. On her part, Jennie had sincerely, deeply, truly learned to love this man. At first, when he had swept her off her feet, overawed her soul, and used her necessity as a chain wherewith to bind her to him, she was a little doubtful, a little afraid of him, although she had always liked him. Now, however, by living with him, by knowing him better, by watching his moods, she had come to love him. He was so big, so vocal, so handsome. His point of view and opinions of anything and everything were so positive. His pet motto, "Hew to the line, let the chips fall where they may," had clung in her brain as something immensely characteristic. Apparently, he was not afraid of anything, God, man, or devil. He used to look at her, holding her chin between the thumb and fingers of his big brown hand, and say, "You're sweet, all right, but you need courage and defiance. You haven't enough of those things." And her eyes would meet his in dumb appeal. "Never mind," he would add, "you have other things." And then he would kiss her. One of the most appealing things to Lester was the simple way in which she tried to avoid exposure of her various social and educational shortcomings. She could not write very well, and once he found a list of words he had used written out on a piece of paper with the meanings opposite. He smiled, but he liked her better for it. Another time in the Southern Hotel in St. Louis, he watched her pretending a loss of appetite because she thought that her lack of table manners was being observed by nearby diners. She could not always be sure of the right forks and knives, and the strange-looking dishes bothered her. How did one eat asparagus and artichokes? "Why don't you eat something?" he asked good-naturedly. "You're hungry, aren't you?" "Not very." "You must be. Listen, Jennie, I know what it is. You mustn't feel that way. Your manners are all right. I wouldn't bring you here if they weren't. Your instincts are all right. Don't be uneasy. I'd tell you quick enough when there was anything wrong." His brown eyes held a friendly gleam. She smiled gratefully. "I do feel a little nervous at times," she admitted. "Don't," he repeated. "You're all right. Don't worry, I'll show you." And he did. By degrees, Jennie grew into an understanding of the usages and customs of comfortable existence. All that the Gerhardt family had ever had were the bare necessities of life. Now she was surrounded with whatever she wanted: trunks, clothes, toilet articles, the whole varied equipment of comfort. And while she liked it all, it did not upset her sense of proportion and her sense of the fitness of things. There was no element of vanity in her, only a sense of joy and privilege and opportunity. She was grateful to Lester for all that he had done and was doing for her. If she could hold him, if only she could hold him, always. The details of getting Vesta established once adjusted, Jennie settled down into the routine of home life. Lester, busy about his multitudinous affairs, was in and out. He had a suite of rooms reserved for himself at the Grand Pacific, which was then the exclusive hotel of Chicago, and this was his ostensible residence. His luncheon and evening appointments were kept at the Union Club. An early patron of the telephone, he had one installed in the apartment so that he could reach Jennie quickly and at any time. He was home 2 or 3 nights a week, sometimes oftener. He insisted at first on Jennie having a girl of general housework, but acquiesced in the more sensible arrangement which she suggested later of letting someone come in to do the cleaning. She liked to work around her own home. Her natural industry and love of order prompted this feeling. Lester liked his breakfast promptly at 8 in the morning. He wanted dinner served nicely at 7. Silverware, cut glass, imported china, all the little luxuries of life appealed to him. He kept his trunks and wardrobe at the apartment. During the first few months, everything went smoothly. He was in the habit of taking Jennie to the theater now and then, and if he chanced to run across an acquaintance, he always introduced her as Miss Gerhardt. When he registered her as his wife, it was usually under an assumed name. Where there was no danger of detection, he did not mind using his own signature. Thus far, there had been no difficulty or unpleasantness of any kind. The trouble with this situation was that it was crisscrossed with the danger and consequent worry which the deception in regard to Vesta had entailed, as well as with Jennie's natural anxiety about her father and the disorganized home. Jennie feared, as Veronica hinted, that she and William would go to live with Martha, who was installed in a boarding house in Cleveland, and that Gerhardt would be left alone. He was such a pathetic figure to her, with his injured hands and his one ability, that of being a watchman, that she was hurt to think of his being left alone. Would he come to her? She knew that he would not, feeling as he did at present. Would Lester have him? She was not sure of that. If he came, Vesta would have to be accounted for. So she worried. The situation in regard to Vesta was really complicated. Owing to the feeling that she was doing her daughter a great injustice, Jennie was particularly sensitive in regard to her, anxious to do 1,000 things to make up for the one great duty that she could not perform. She daily paid a visit to the home of Mrs. Olson, always taking with her toys, candy, or whatever came into her mind as being likely to interest and please her child. She liked to sit with Vesta and tell her stories of fairy and giant, which kept the little girl wide-eyed. At last, she went so far as to bring her to the apartment when Lester was away visiting his parents, and she soon found it possible during his several absences to do this regularly. After that, as time went on and she began to know his habits, she became more bold. Although bold is scarcely the word to use in connection with Jennie. She became venturesome, much as a mouse might. She would risk Vesta's presence on the assurance of even short absences, 2 or 3 days. She even got into the habit of keeping a few of Vesta's toys at the apartment so that she could have something to play with when she came. During these several visits from her child, Jennie could not but realize the lovely thing life would be were she only an honored wife and a happy mother. Vesta was a most observant little girl. She could, by her innocent, childish questions, give 100 turns to the dagger of self-reproach, which was already planted deeply in Jennie's heart. "Can I come to live with you?" was one of her simplest and most frequently repeated questions. Jennie would reply that Mama could not have her just yet, but that very soon now, just as soon as she possibly could, Vesta should come to stay always. "Don't you know just when?" Vesta would ask. "No, dearest, not just when. Very soon now. You won't mind waiting a little while. Don't you like Mrs. Olson?" "Yes," replied Vesta, "but then she ain't got any nice things now. She's just got old things." Jenny, stricken to the heart, would take Vesta to the toy shop and load her down with a new assortment of playthings. Of course, Lester was not in the least suspicious. His observation of things relating to the home were rather casual. He went about his work and his pleasures believing Jenny to be the soul of sincerity and good-natured service, and it never occurred to him that there was anything underhanded in her actions. Once he did come home sick in the afternoon and found her absent, an absence which endured from 2 o'clock to 5. He was a little irritated and grumbled on her return, but his annoyance was as nothing to her astonishment and fright when she found him there. She blanched at the thought of his suspecting something and explained as best she could. She had gone to see her washerwoman. She was slow about her marketing. She didn't dream he was there. She was sorry, too, that her absence had lost her an opportunity to serve him. It showed her what a mess she was likely to make of it all. It happened that about 3 weeks after the above occurrence, Lester had occasion to return to Cincinnati for a week. And during this time, Jenny again brought Vesta to the flat. For 4 days, there was the happiest goings-on between the mother and child. Nothing would have come of this little reunion had it not been for an oversight on Jenny's part, the far-reaching effects of which she could only afterward regret. This was the leaving of a little toy lamb under the large leather divan in the front room, where Lester was wont to lie and smoke. A little bell held by a thread of blue ribbon was fastened about its neck, and this tinkled feebly whenever it was shaken. Vesta, with the unaccountable freakishness of children, had deliberately dropped it behind the divan, an action which Jenny did not notice at the time. When she gathered up the various playthings after Vesta's departure, she overlooked it entirely, and there it rested, its innocent eyes still staring upon the sunlit regions of Toyland, when Lester returned. That same evening, when he was lying on the divan, quietly enjoying his cigar and his newspaper, he chanced to drop the former fully lighted. Wishing to recover it before it should do any damage, he leaned over and looked under the divan. The cigar was not in his sight, so he rose and pulled the lounge out, a move which revealed to him the little lamb still standing where Vesta had dropped it. He picked it up, turning it over and over and wondering how it had come there. A lamb! It must belong to some neighbor's child in whom Jenny had taken an interest, he thought. He would have to go and tease her about this. Accordingly, he held the toy jovially before him, and coming out into the dining room where Jenny was working at the sideboard, he exclaimed in a mock solemn voice, "Where did this come from?" Jenny, who was totally unconscious of the existence of this evidence of her duplicity, turned, and was instantly possessed with the idea that he had suspected all, and was about to visit his just wrath upon her. Instantly the blood flamed in her cheeks and as quickly left them. Why, she stuttered, "it's the little toy I bought." "I see it is," he returned genially, her guilty tremor not escaping his observation, but having at the same time no explicable significance to him. "It's frisking around a mighty lone sheepfold." He touched the little bell at its throat, while Jenny stood there, unable to speak. It tinkled feebly, and then he looked at her again. His manner was so humorous that she could tell he suspected nothing. However, it was almost impossible for her to recover her self-possession. "What's ailing you?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied. "You look as though a lamb was a terrible shock to you." "I forgot to take it out from there, that's all," she went on blindly. "It looks as though it has been played with enough," he added more seriously. And then, seeing that the discussion was evidently painful to her, he dropped it. The lamb had not furnished him the amusement that he had expected. Lester went back into the front room, stretched himself out, and thought it over. Why was she nervous? What was there about a toy to make her grow pale? Surely there was no harm in her harboring some youngster of the neighborhood when she was alone, having it come in and play. Why should she be so nervous? He thought it over but could come to no conclusion. Nothing more was said about the incident of the toy lamb. Time might have wholly effaced the impression from Lester's memory had nothing else intervened to arouse his suspicions. But a mishap of any kind seems invariably to be linked with others which follow closely upon its heels. One evening, when Lester happened to be lingering about the flat later than usual, the doorbell rang, and Jennie being busy in the kitchen, Lester went himself to open the door. He was greeted by a middle-aged lady who frowned very nervously upon him and inquired in broken Swedish accents for Jennie. "Wait a moment," said Lester, and stepping to the rear door he called for her. Jennie came, and seeing who the visitor was, she stepped nervously out in the hall and closed the door behind her. The action instantly struck Lester as suspicious. He frowned and determined to inquire thoroughly into the matter. A moment later, Jennie reappeared. Her face was white, and her fingers seemed to be nervously seeking something to seize upon. "What's the trouble?" he inquired, the irritation he had felt the moment before giving his voice a touch of gruffness. "I've got to go out for a little while," she at last managed to reply. "Very well," he assented unwillingly. "But you can tell me what's the trouble with you, can't you? Where do you have to go?" I began Jennie stammering. I have... "Yes," he said grimly. "I have to go on an errand," she stumbled on. "I can't wait. I'll tell you when I come back, Lester. Please don't ask me now." She looked vainly at him, her troubled countenance still marked by preoccupation and anxiety to get away. And Lester, who had never seen this look of intense responsibility in her before, was moved and irritated by it. "That's all right," he said, "but what's the use of all this secrecy? Why can't you come out and tell me what's the matter with you? What's the use of this whispering behind doors? Where do you have to go?" He paused, checked by his own harshness. Jennie, who was intensely wrought up by the information she had received, as well as the unwanted verbal castigation she was now enduring, rose to an emotional state never reached by her before. "I will, Lester, I will," she exclaimed. "Only not now. I haven't time. I'll tell you everything when I come back. Please don't stop me now." She hurried to the adjoining chamber to get her wraps. And Lester, who had even yet no clear conception of what it all meant, followed her stubbornly to the door. "See here," he exclaimed in his vigorous, brutal way. "You're not acting right. What's the matter with you? I want to know." He stood in the doorway, his whole frame exhibiting the pugnacity and settled determination of a man who was bound to be obeyed. Jennie, troubled and driven to bay, turned at last. "It's my child, Lester," she exclaimed. "It's dying. I haven't time to talk. Please don't stop me. I'll tell you everything when I come back." "Your child?" he exclaimed. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I couldn't help it," she returned. "I was afraid. I should have told you long ago. I meant to only... Oh, let me go now, and I'll tell you all when I come back." He stared at her in amazement. Then he stepped aside, unwilling to force her any further for the present. "Well, go ahead," he said quietly. "Don't you want someone to go along with you?" "No," she replied. "Mrs. Olson is right here. I'll go with her." She hurried forth, white-faced, and he stood there, pondering. Could this be the woman he had thought he knew? Why, she had been deceiving him for years. Jennie! The white-faced, the simple. He choked a little as he muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Chapter 29. The reason why Jennie had been called was nothing more than one of those infantile seizures, the coming end result of which no man can predict 2 hours beforehand. Vesta had been seriously taken with membranous croup only a few hours before, and the development since had been so rapid that the poor old Swedish mother was half frightened to death herself, and hastily dispatched a neighbor to say that Vesta was very ill, and Mrs. Kane was to come at once. This message, delivered as it was in a very nervous manner, by one whose only object was to bring her, had induced the soul-wrecking fear of death in Jenny, and caused her to brave the discovery of Lester in the manner described. Jenny hurried on anxiously, her one thought being to reach her child before the arm of death could interfere and snatch it from her. Her mind weighed upon by a legion of fears. What if it should already be too late when she got there? What if Vesta already should be no more? Instinctively she quickened her pace, and as the street lamps came and receded in the gloom, she forgot all the sting of Lester's words, all fear that he might turn her out and leave her alone in a great city with a little child to care for, and remembered only the fact that her Vesta was very ill, possibly dying, and that she was the direct cause of the child's absence from her. That perhaps but for the want of her care and attention Vesta might be well tonight. If I can only get there, she kept saying to herself. And then with that frantic unreason which is the chief characteristic of the instinct-driven mother, I might have known that God would punish me for my unnatural conduct. I might have known. When she reached the gate, she fairly sped up the little walk and into the house, where Vesta was lying pale, quiet, and weak, but considerably better. Several Swedish neighbors and a middle-aged physician were in attendance, all of whom looked at her curiously as she dropped beside the child's bed and spoke to her. Jenny's mind had been made up. She had sinned, and sinned grievously, against her daughter, but now she would make amends so far as possible. Lester was very dear to her, but she would no longer attempt to deceive him in anything, even if he left her. She felt an agonized stab, a pain at the thought. She must still do the one right thing. Vesta must not be an outcast any longer. Her mother must give her a home. Where Jenny was, there must Vesta be. Sitting by the bedside in this humble Swedish cottage, Jenny realized the fruitlessness of her deception, the trouble and pain it had created in her home, the months of suffering it had given her with Lester, the agony it had heaped upon her this night. And to what end? The truth had been discovered anyhow. She sat there and meditated, not knowing what next was to happen, while Vesta quieted down and then went soundly to sleep. Lester, after recovering from the first heavy import of this discovery, asked himself some perfectly natural questions. Who was the father of the child? How old was it? How did it chance to be in Chicago, and who was taking care of it? He could ask, but he could not answer. He knew absolutely nothing. Curiously now, as he thought, his first meeting with Jenny at Mrs. Bracebridge's came back to him. What was it about her then that had attracted him? What made him think, after a few hours' observation, that he could seduce her to do his will? What was it? Moral looseness or weakness or what? There must have been an art in this sorry affair, the practiced art of the cheat, and in deceiving such a confiding nature as his, she had done even more than practice deception. She had been ungrateful. Now the quality of ingratitude was a very objectionable thing to Lester, the last and most offensive trait of a debased nature, and to be able to discover a trace of it in Jenny was very disturbing. It is true that she had not exhibited it in any other way before, quite to the contrary, but nevertheless he saw strong evidences of it now, and it made him very bitter in his feeling toward her. How could she be guilty of any such conduct toward him? Had he not picked her up out of nothing, so to speak, and befriended her? He moved from his chair in the silent room and began to pace slowly to and fro, the weightiness of this subject exercising to the full his power of decision. She was guilty of a misdeed which he felt able to condemn. The original concealment was evil, the continued deception more. Lastly, there was the thought that her love, after all, had been divided, part for him, part for the child, a discovery which no man in his position could contemplate with serenity. He moved irritably as he thought of it, shoved his hands in his pockets and walked to and fro across the floor. That a man of Lester's temperament should consider himself wronged by Jennie merely because she had concealed a child whose existence was due to conduct no more irregular than he was involved later in the yielding of herself to him was an example of those inexplicable perversions of judgment to which the human mind, in its capacity of keeper of the honor of others, seems permanently committed. Lester, aside from his own personal conduct, for men seldom judge with that in the balance, had faith in the ideal that a woman should reveal herself completely to the one man with whom she is in love. And the fact that she had not done so was a grief to him. He had asked her once tentatively about her past. She begged him not to press her. That was the time she should have spoken of any child. Now, he shook his head. His first impulse, after he had thought the thing over, was to walk out and leave her. At the same time, he was curious to hear the end of this business. He did put on his hat and coat, however, and went out, stopping at the first convenient saloon to get a drink. He took a car and went down to the club, strolling about the different rooms and chatting with several people whom he encountered. He was restless and irritated, and finally, after 3 hours of meditation, he took a cab and returned to his apartment. The distraught Jennie, sitting by her sleeping child, was at last made to realize by its peaceful breathing that all danger was over. There was nothing more that she could do for Vesta, and now the claims of the home that she had deserted began to reassert themselves. The promise to Lester and the need of being loyal to her duties and to this very end. Lester might possibly be waiting for her. It was just probable that he wished to hear the remainder of her story before breaking with her entirely. Although anguished and frightened by the certainty, as she deemed it, of his forsaking her, she nevertheless felt that it was no more than she deserved, a just punishment for all her misdoings. When Jennie arrived at the flat, it was after 11, and the hall light was already out. She first tried the door, and then inserted her key. No one stirred, however, and opening the door, she entered in the expectation of seeing Lester sternly confronting her. He was not there, however. The burning gas had merely been an oversight on his part. She glanced quickly about, but seeing only the empty room, she came instantly to the other conclusion, that he had forsaken her, and so stood there a meditative, helpless figure. Gone, she thought. At this moment his footsteps sounded on the stairs. He came in with his derby hat pulled low over his broad forehead, close to his sandy eyebrows, and with his overcoat buttoned up closely about his neck. He took off the coat without looking at Jennie and hung it on the rack. Then he deliberately took off his hat and hung that up also. When he was through, he turned to where she was watching him with wide eyes. I want to know about this thing now, from beginning to end, he began. Whose child is that? Jennie wavered a moment, as one who might be going to take a leap in the dark, then opened her lips mechanically and confessed. It's Senator Brander's. Senator Brander, echoed Lester, the familiar name of the dead but still famous statesman ringing with shocking an unexpected force in his ears. How did you come to know him? We used to do his washing for him, she rejoined simply. My mother and I. Lester paused. The baldness of the statements issuing from her sobering even the baldness of the statements issuing from her sobering even his rancorous mood. Senator Brander's child, he thought to himself. So that great representative of the interests of the common people was the undoer of her, a self-confessed washerwoman's daughter. A fine tragedy of low life all this was. How long ago was this? He demanded, his face the picture of a darkling mood. It's been nearly 6 years now, she returned. He calculated the time that had elapsed since he had known her, and then continued. How old is the child? She's a little over 5. Lester moved a little. The need for serious thought made his tone more peremptory, but less bitter. Where have you been keeping her all this time? She was at home until you went to Cincinnati last spring. I went down and brought her then. Was she there the times I came to Cleveland? Yes, said Jennie, but I didn't let her come out anywhere where you could see her. I thought you said you told your people that you were married, he exclaimed, wondering how this relationship of the child to the family could have been adjusted. I did, she replied, but I didn't want to tell you about her. They thought all the time I intended to. Well, why didn't you? Because I was afraid. Afraid of what? I didn't know what was going to become of me when I went with you, Lester. I didn't want to do her any harm if I could help it. I was ashamed afterward. When you said you didn't like children, I was afraid. Afraid I'd leave you? Yes. He stopped. The simplicity of her answers removing a part of the suspicion of artful duplicity which had originally weighed upon him. After all, there was not so much of that in it as mere wretchedness of circumstance and cowardice of morals. What a family she must have! What queer non-moral natures they must have to have brooked any such a combination of affairs! Didn't you know that you'd be found out in the long run? He at last demanded. Surely you might have seen that you couldn't raise her that way. Why didn't you tell me in the first place? I wouldn't have thought anything of it then. I know, she said. I wanted to protect her. Where is she now? He asked. Jennie explained. She stood there, the contradictory aspect of these questions and of his attitude puzzling even herself. She did try to explain them after a time, but all Lester could gain was that she had blundered along without any artifice at all. A condition that was so manifest that had he been in any other position than that he was, he might have pitied her. As it was, the revelation concerning Brander was hanging over him, and he finally returned to that. You say your mother used to do washing for him. How did you come to get in with him? Jennie, who until now had borne his questions with unmoving pain, winced at this. He was now encroaching upon the period that was by far the most distressing memory of her life. What he had just asked seemed to be a demand upon her to make everything clear. I was so young, Lester, she pleaded. I was only 18. I didn't know. I used to go to the hotel where he was stopping and get his laundry, and at the end of the week I'd take it to him again. She paused, and as he took a chair, looking as if he expected to hear the whole story, she continued. We were so poor. He used to give me money to give to my mother. I didn't know. She paused again, totally unable to go on, and he, seeing that it would be impossible for her to explain without prompting, took up his questioning again, eliciting by degrees the whole pitiful story. Brander had intended to marry her. He had written to her, but before he could come to her, he died. The confession was complete. It was followed by a period of 5 minutes in which Lester said nothing at all. He put his arm on the mantel and stared at the wall, while Jennie waited, not knowing what would follow, not wishing to make a single plea. The clock ticked audibly. Lester's face betrayed no sign of either thought or feeling. He was now quite calm, quite sober, wondering what he should do. Jennie was before him as the criminal at the bar. He, the righteous, the moral, the pure of heart, was in the judgment seat. Now to sentence her, to make up his mind what course of action he should pursue. It was a disagreeable tangle, to be sure, something that a man of his position and wealth really ought not to have anything to do with. This child, the actuality of it, put an almost unbearable face upon the whole matter, and yet he was not quite prepared to speak. He turned after a time, the silvery tinkle of the French clock on the mantel striking 3, and causing him to become aware of Jennie, pale, uncertain, still standing as she had stood all this while. "Better go to bed," he said at last, and fell again to pondering this difficult problem. But Jennie continued to stand there wide-eyed, expectant, ready to hear at any moment his decision as to her fate. She waited in vain, however. After a long time of musing, he turned and went to the clothes rack near the door. "Better go to bed," he said indifferently. "I'm going out." She turned instinctively, feeling that even in this crisis there was some little service that she might render. But he did not see her. He went out, vouchsafing no further speech. She looked after him, and as his footsteps sounded on the stair, she felt as if she were doomed, and hearing her own death knell. What had she done? What would he do now? She stood there, a dissonance of despair, and when the lower door clicked, moved her hand out of the agony of her suppressed hopelessness. Gone, she thought. Gone. In the light of a late dawn, she was still sitting there pondering, her state far too urgent for idle tears.